Our next keynote speaker is John Matonis. He might just have the answer to this question. He's the founding director of the Bitcoin Foundation and chairman at Globitex. He'll be speaking about the post-legal tender era. Please welcome with an applause, John Matonis.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Welcome to Zurich. In addition to being the first executive director of the Bitcoin Foundation, I also serve as a non-executive independent board director for 4 different Bitcoin startups. I'm also an advisor on the BCT project here, that is one of the major sponsors. And I'm also an advisor for Tontine Trust, which suspiciously is not a sponsor. And the Tontine Trust project is near and dear to my heart because they are reviving an old concept that goes back almost 400 years to the days of King William. And this is death on the blockchain. It's a reinvigoration of this old concept and making it new again for your retirement, for insurance for your retirement. No one wants to outlive their money. So investigate Tontine Trust. Now, since this is an ICO summit, I would be remiss if I didn't start with a few comments around ICOs, even though it's a post-legal tender age talk. What I want to say about ICOs is that regulators are flummoxed by ICOs. Regardless of the jurisdiction, they don't know what to do. They're only used to the 2 ways that companies can raise capital, either by selling equity or by selling debt. Issuing tokens is another legitimate way for a project or a company or an entity to raise capital, but it doesn't fit in any one of the boxes. And this is what drives them crazy. Now you can have utility tokens, you can have security tokens. I actually think that the real innovation and the promise is around the utility tokens. The cost and complexity and the additional regulatory requirements for security tokens kind of outweigh, in my opinion, the benefits for those. Now the SEC in the United States will say there's no such thing as a utility token. They say they're all security tokens. They haven't seen a utility token yet. But we know that's not true. They just have not classified it properly yet. And in the world of tokens, you have probably a top tier of 3 or 5 that actually operate as money. So these would be things like the public blockchains, so the ones that have attained the function of money, and they're used to buy into the other projects, like ICOs. So that would be your Bitcoin Cash, Ethereum, the immutable version of Ethereum, which is Ethereum Classic, and then other coins like Litecoin and Monero that generally circulate as money. The ICO tokens are not to be confused with those because they operate in a different area. They're very specific sometimes to a project, to a company, to an application. That's why they're called utility tokens. So people, companies, regulators try to mix all these up, and we shouldn't do that because the crypto tokens associated with ICOs are going to be more like penny stocks, or even the ability to start a new token that has a life of its own after the issuing company is gone. That's why so many of them are putting the capital into a foundation so that it can outlive the issuing company. But what I want to talk about today is what makes something money. All money is an illusion. Fiat money is an illusion, and even Bitcoin's an illusion. Why do I say it's an illusion? Well, with fiat money, the the prevailing thought around legitimizing that comes from George Knapp, who's an author in the early part of the 20th century that wrote a book called The State Theory of Money. And the state theory of money says that money gets its value from the state. It's only legal tender that can have value. And the opposite of that viewpoint comes from Karl Menger with the Austrian School of Economics, which says that money can evolve spontaneously. It doesn't need to be legitimized by the state. It can come from the market and for what people believe and determine to be money. So one is legal tender, legitimized and sanctioned by the state, and the other is spontaneous market-evolved money. Now, what they despise so much on the central bank and government side is that they know it's an illusion too. They know it's an illusion, and they have dominated the illusion. But what they really can't stand is when there is a competing illusion, an illusion from the bottom up. And that's what decentralized cryptocurrencies represent. They represent our illusion. You know, we should be able to determine our own illusion. We don't have to go by the state-sanctioned illusion, which is a top-down illusion. So this is why I'm such an advocate for decentralized cryptocurrencies. Now, how do they get to this monetary status? I look at this from the perspective of a monetary economist. And the three functions of money are store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. How are we going to know when Bitcoin, something like Bitcoin, is successful? How are we going to be able to declare it's a win? It's already successful as a medium of exchange, but how does it get there? And the path is really sequential. So all of these three functions don't happen simultaneously. They're in sequence. You have to be a store of value before you're a medium of exchange. That's what the famous pizza transaction from 2011 demonstrated. And then the final stage is going from medium of exchange to unit of account. Unit of account is when you know that we have won. That's when you start seeing goods and services priced in the numeraire. So you would go into a market, you would see things priced in a cryptocurrency. You don't see that today. And we're probably a long way from that because we haven't crossed that bridge from the medium of exchange function to the unit of account function. And central banks have a massive advantage in that area because they're the incumbent. It's very hard to dislodge the incumbent. It's only been done recently in 2000 when the euro displaced things like the lira, the peseta, the French franc. But that was a government illusion replacing another government illusion. So now we're looking at Bitcoin, which when it gets to that numeraire status, the process will be complete. But there's so many exciting things along the way. A lot of people call Bitcoin digital gold. I call gold analog Bitcoin. And the properties are very similar. We are living in a time where we're lucky to be alive. We have never seen the ability to start interest rates, to have an interest rate market that develops. And there is an interest rate market for Bitcoin. Students of the capital markets should be amazed by this because we're part of the formation of a new capital market. The Bitcoin annual interest rate is about 25 to 38% annualized. We know this because you can get the overnight rates from the exchanges that lend you Bitcoin to go short. Those are overnight lending rates for Bitcoin. So you have to annualize those because nobody's making a market yet in 1 year money for Bitcoin. They're only making a market for overnight money. Okay, so where do I want to challenge everyone today? I want to challenge you on the thinking of the legal tender age. That's the title. We grew up and we've been born in the legal tender world. But our children and our children's children will not be living in a legal tender age. I like to focus on what will change when we complete this progression. And when cryptocurrencies are at the point where they're challenging central banks, maybe they're on the reserve balance sheet as a reserve currency with some central banks, but they're also operating independently. And the ecosystem is large enough to be measured as a separate GDP. What changes? There's going to be changes on the monetary policy side and the fiscal policy side. The monetary policy changes are going to be the obvious ones, like central bank will not control and manipulate the interest rates, short-term or long-term interest rates. The other monetary policy implication is that we will probably not have fractional reserve banking. It hasn't been demonstrated yet, even, that fractional reserve banking can be possible with cryptocurrencies. It's great as a reserve asset, but it will probably not be a fractional reserve system because there's no such thing as a lender of last resort in Bitcoin. Mt. Gox was actually a positive demonstration of that. People who point the finger at Mt. Gox being a disaster, they fail to recognize that the system as a whole worked perfectly. The losses at Mt. Gox were not socialized. The taxpayers didn't bail out Gox. It was caveat emptor. And the losses at banks shouldn't be socialized, and taxpayers shouldn't bail out banks. So with Bitcoin, there's no lender of last resort. Now, how does it impact the fiscal policy side? This is the part that I think is very interesting. This is where we'll start to see changes that affect the everyday person on the street. So the first thing that we'll see in the post-legal tender age on the fiscal policy side is that spending will have to match the revenues that the government is able to raise. They won't be able to do deficit financing or deficit spending to embark on military adventurism and then worry about how they're going to pay for it later. Without fractional reserve banking, government spending can only be raised through taxation. That's the only way government gets their money. They don't have a secret pot of money. They only get it from what they're able to obtain through taxes, corporate taxes or individual taxes. Now, this is where it gets really, really interesting with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, because the second major implication on the fiscal policy side is that we are likely to see in our lifetime the end of the income tax. Now, I'm in favor of this because it's a highly progressive tax. What will happen when governments can no longer rely on income taxation for their revenue? We will most likely see a shift. We'll see a shift from income-based taxation to consumption-based taxation. So taxes aren't going away. We won't see the end of taxation, but we will probably see things like the VAT increasing from where they are now. And the reason for this is because it will be more and more difficult for taxing authorities to ascertain true income. But it won't be that difficult for them to ascertain spending. Spending is a physical merchant thing. You're able to monitor that and to audit that a lot more than you are on the income side. So we are probably the last generation living in the era of income taxation. And I tend to welcome this. I hope it's only one of the many positive innovations, but we will see a string of implications when we enter the post-legal tender age. Thank you for your time.